They think that if Russia were to launch a nuke, then like in that movie, was it War Games with Matthew Broderick, all the nukes go flying in the air. And I just don't think that's reality, because the reality of strategy in war is not that some dude sitting at a computer and he's like, well, a nuke was fired, better fire ours.
But I will say, if it was World War II, if the Japanese had nuclear bombs, that they probably would have dropped them back on the United States after Nagasaki.
Perhaps, but those were gravity bombs. So the very first nuclear weapons were dropped out of bombers. And after we knew the capabilities, the Germans knew the capabilities of nuclear bombs. And there was a rush to weaponize this, and we got there first. The United States, knowing the capability of a gravity bomb, seeing a bomber with fighters on its wing, they'd be like, stop that bomber. And we would definitely be prepared for something like that.
But we shouldn't allow geography, I think, to govern our assessments in this area, so that if it's simply the fact that the United States and Russia are so far away from each other, and it would require intercontinental ballistic missiles for this kind of exchange to occur, let's shrink our example to India and Pakistan, okay, which are not as far away from each other and are both nuclear armed, and which have a history of conflict with each other. Okay, do you believe that mutually assured destruction theory obtains in that theater?
We need to break down what it really means. In that there is the reality that if Vladimir Putin fired an ICBM, a MIRV, for instance, nuclear armed, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicle with 12 warheads. It goes up into the air, ejects 12 warheads to pepper the eastern seaboard of the United States. The United States would absolutely fire in retaliation.
Okay.
But that is an oversimplification of what nuclear war likely will be. So in your example with India and Pakistan, we're not talking about a 8,000 mile launch of an ICBM into space, which we all know is coming, and then be like, there it is, and we know it's heading for us. We can't stop it. Fire. What I think that the mistake is that when you talk about nuclear war, people only think one thing: an ICBM launching from a silo in the ground in Siberia or in Oklahoma and then flying through the air. When in reality, what's likely going to happen is Vladimir Putin, when he escalates to nuclear war, is going to take nuclear artillery, and he's probably going to use lower yield gravity bombs, 100 kiloton, maybe even getting to the point of a megaton. These are much, much smaller these days, and attacking Ukraine to win if he has to. No one in the West is going to retaliate with a nuclear strike on Russia if Russia uses nukes to win the war in Ukraine.
However, our leaders in the present government, including the National Security Advisor at the White House, let's say, Jake Sullivan, have stated many times that they have communicated to the Kremlin through the channels they have, and they have them, that very, very severe consequences would befall Mr. Putin and his government if any kind of nuclear weapon were introduced into this conflict.
And that's not a U.S. retaliatory strike on Russia.
Right.
So
what would you imagine would be our most severe response?
Sanctions. If Russia introduced, the most severe, I'd imagine, is a U.S. declaration of war. And
no, I mean, really could actually imagine taking place.
Right. Yeah. I think there's a strong possibility that if Vladimir Putin were to use tactical nuclear artillery or small, lower yield weapons, nuclear weapons in Ukraine, that NATO would formally declare war and the U.S. would enter the war and have a strong, probably generate a decent amount of public support if they come out and say, they just use nukes. We're not going to, the world will not be destroyed. We must stop this madman. And I think that's very likely. So Putin may be concerned that if he escalates to that point, he gives a casus belli to the West to directly invade and engage. Right now, it's relatively passive what the U.S. is doing. That being said, Putin is not playing a game to lose. And if pushed to that brink, I genuinely believe he will be like, well, it's either I lose now or I lose against NATO in a year. Fire the nukes. But we'll see. I don't know.
One aspect of this is that his military is so depleted as a result of this catastrophic,
I don't believe it,
misadventure.
Yeah. Those leaks showed that the amount of casualties was substantially less than they'd been reporting. And what was it actually?
But wasn't that supposed to have been doctored? Wasn't that the one part of the document that was supposed to have been
so much
altered?
fog of war?
I perhaps, but I just think it's fascinating, this idea that Russia, which is a massive economy, would be losing to the only country that's become poorer since the fall of the Soviet Union.
But they're not just fighting that country. They're obviously fighting a coalition that's supplying them and
Right.
training them and so on.
U.S. veterans and volunteers.
Look, you don't have to be a military analyst or have military experience to assess this conflict and to be able to discern accurately that it hasn't gone well for Russia, and that it, you know, what was the operating premise of both the Russians and the West at the start of the conflict was that it wasn't going to last very long, and that they would, if they had the gumption, if they had the nerve to launch this kind of violence, kinetic military violence in Europe, which hasn't seen this kind of thing since World War II, if he was willing to cross that line, he was going to have an easy time capturing Kyiv and deposing the Zelensky government.
Well, you know, Putin's problem was that he sat back and let NATO expand for decades. And that was Russia's problem. And it's like only now they're willing to engage in military conflict. They've basically lost at this point.